Hello everyone, you're very welcome to the launch of a briefing paper on the future of wearable technologies from Imperial College London. First point of order is an apology. So the link that has been sent to you through the Eventbrite is essentially the backstage link. For those of you that are trying to access that link, please don't. We have posted the correct link in the chat literally just a few moments ago. So if you could please use that link, that would be much appreciated. We are going to send an email through Eventbrite with the correct link as well. So hopefully you can all hear me in the virtual auditorium that we have created. Okay, so presuming there are people out there, my name is Kieran Brophy. I'm one of the co-authors of this briefing paper, and I'd like to start by saying a massive thank you for joining us. I know myself that there is a lot of online events going on at the minute, not to mention certain football tournaments, so we appreciate so many of you signing up and hopefully at least hearing us loud and clear. So over the next hour or so, we hope to discuss what the likes of your smartwatch, for example, could be capable of in the not too distant future. But even now, in 2021, wearables are a massively expanding market. There's a good chance that you're probably wearing one right now. So we will be asking questions such as, should there be more stringent rules on what companies can or cannot do with our most personal of data? And also, how can academia, regulators, and big tech all work together to create the next generation of wearables to keep us all safe as consumers? So I can't promise we'll definitively answer all those questions within 1 hour, but with a panel of leading experts in the field, well, we'll certainly do our best. And judging by the bings in the background, there are many people who are hopefully trying to hear us. Okay, so let's just quickly look at the running order for the next hour. So I'll be giving you a brief bit of background to our project, how it all began, and what we're trying to achieve. And then we will go on to the key findings of our paper with some leading researchers from Imperial College. And then it's on to the main part, our panel discussion, where we will be joined by two people whose, some might say, Herculean job is to regulate wearables. So really looking forward to that. Yeah, you can send any questions you have at any point using the Q&A function, which for me is at the top of the screen with two speech bubbles. And so we'll try and put any questions you have to our panelists then. So all that to come, but first, just a quick bit about who we are. So it was the Institute for Molecular Science and Engineering, or IMSE, who instigated and developed this project, I guess. So IMSE is one of Imperial's global challenge institutes, and its aim is to bring together engineers, scientists, clinicians, and business people to develop new solutions using this cross-disciplinary team of researchers. And I think it's fair to say that this this briefing paper certainly has done that. And since the main conclusion of our paper, without giving away too many spoilers for what's coming, is that regulators and policymakers really need to act now when it comes to wearables. So we thought it would be remiss of us not to invite our friends in the forum, which are Imperial's policy engagement program. And so if you are a policymaker or an academic watching this and you want to find ways to connect with each other, then please contact their team. Okay, so on to wearable tech. So I guess this project all began over a year ago now, when IMSE kind of identified that there were these disparate group of researchers at Imperial, chemical engineers, bioengineers, medics, even a psychologist, looking at all the different aspects related to wearables. And we thought that if we could bring this expertise together with what we thought at the time was quite a simple question: what could wearables look like in 10 years' time? Then we could get a well-rounded and big picture to answer that question. And then I guess once we answered that, or began to answer it, it became apparent that if we have a rough idea of all these technological advancements coming down the line, we need to do something now in terms of regulation and policy making. So in answering both of those questions, we wrote a briefing paper, which I guess needs an explanation. So unlike a conventional academic journal article that you might be familiar with, it's specifically written to be understood by a non-specialized and general audience. So hopefully, for those of you in the auditorium now, there should be a link to the briefing paper in the chat. If not, there should be one very soon. And so for the next 10 minutes or so, we will hear the answers to both of those questions that we posed and form the basis of the briefing paper. So to answer the first question, we have Firat Guder. He's a senior lecturer in the Department of Bioengineering here at Imperial. And amongst other things, Firat looks at wearable and implantable monitoring devices for both humans and animals. And it's worth saying that he has been at the forefront of wearable technology and sensor design for the past decade. So we thought, who better to outline what the next decade could bring? So Firat, if you can hear me, it's over to you.
I can hear you. Thank you very much, Kieran. Welcome everyone to this event. My goal in the next 5 minutes or so is to kind of give you some hints about what this tech briefing it really contains, and the kinds of things that we actually do at Imperial that are covered. Next slide, please. So medical devices, wearable devices until now have been really classified as medical devices and wellness devices. So in this briefing paper, we really tried to hit hard on this distinction and really communicate the message that there is a difference between them, and you cannot necessarily rely on what your wellness device is producing as medical grade let's say data. So the main really distinction in a nutshell between a medical device and here really I'm talking about medical sensors is that medical sensors, they produce medically actionable and medically validated data. On the other hand, wellness devices produce data that cannot really be used for guiding medical intervention or really providing input to or becoming part of really a medical evaluation. But regardless of what, how we define wearable devices as a whole, both the medical and the wellness device sectors are growing. So and this trend is not going to change anytime soon from what it appears. Next slide, please. So the interesting thing that has really happened in recent years is that, as I mentioned, medical devices and wellness devices were kind of these separate things. You know, we had the Fitbit that produced some, let's say, heart rate data or motion data, which could then be used for calculating calories and so on. But and then Apple released a smartwatch that actually provided FDA-approved functionality that could be used as a medical device. So this is a smartwatch that was predominantly intended for wellness previously, but all of a sudden it contained functionality that also allowed it to use as a medical device. And therefore, from just looking at this example, the difference between medical devices and wellness devices are blurring. So we will very likely start seeing more examples of this. So we will actually start walking around with instruments attached to our bodies that can produce high quality medical grade measurements, which can then guide medical decision making. Next slide, please. So if we look at the landscape right now, most wearable devices, especially, for example, the wellness sector, they are smartwatch type devices. However, smartwatches, they cannot really produce or can make measurements that would really allow us to tap into the biochemistry inside our body. And of course, they provide some functionality, but they don't provide all functionality that would be needed for a standard medical evaluation and more. So therefore, at Imperial, there's quite a bit of research going on that will define the future landscape of wearable devices. And these include microneedles. We have several academics working in this area. Then, for example, Professor Danny O'Hare, Tony Cass, Sylvain Ladam, these are just some of the people. And then these microneedle type devices would be essentially patches that would be attached on the skin, and they would penetrate through the skin and then would allow us to make measurements within really the body. And that's something that smartwatches currently cannot do. These are non-invasive devices that basically just sit on top of the skin barrier. And with microneedle type devices, we can tap into the biochemistry of the body in a continuous fashion. And of course, beyond microneedle type devices, wearable sensors could also be injected into the skin. And here, kind of what we're thinking about typical wearable devices, it really kind of changes its meaning. And here we're talking about injectable tattoos that change color when a certain bioanalyte within the body changes, reaches, for example, dangerous levels, either high or low, and so on. And Ali Yetishan is one of the researchers that's working in this area. And in addition to tattoo-like injectable devices, of course, there are researchers at Imperial, including myself, that work on implantable devices, because again, we cannot make all the measurements that are important for monitoring health outside the body. We need to get inside the body for some of the measurements. I mean, for example, something as simple as if we think about core body temperature measurements, it's not really easy to make these measurements outside the body. Therefore, for example, when we're sick, we're trying to insert probes into our ear, our mouth, or in the armpit and so on to really try to get to inside the body as much as possible, although it's not always obvious. And of course, in addition to the injectables and implantables and microneedles, we still do push the state of the art at Imperial in terms of non-invasive devices. Again, I along with Esther Rodriguez, are some of the researchers that work in this area. Next slide, please. And beyond human health, there is an incredibly big driver of monitoring for animals, and so wearable monitoring devices can make a massive impact in terms of how we manage the health of livestock and pets. For example, livestock, we don't really monitor their health that much, and there has been a huge increase in the use of antibiotics that lead to antimicrobial resistance. And ideally, we would like to prevent just preventative and excessive use of antibiotics, and we would like to be able to just monitor animals and give them antibiotics whenever actually we see that they're getting sick. So, and again, the pet market is a huge market that's growing in terms of wearable devices beyond monitoring human health. So at Imperial, my group develops wearable devices for animals for monitoring human health, for monitoring animal health, and for also offline navigation to reduce dependence on GPS, which is a power-hungry and line-of-sight method. And that would be it from my end, Kieran.
Great, thank you so much, Firas. Yeah, absolutely brilliant overview there, and I think has to be said, I for one would be top of the queue to get one of those injectable smart tattoos. I've seen it in the, pardon the pun, in the flesh, or synthetic flesh as it was at the time, and yeah, remarkable piece of technology. So yeah, that's so a great flavour there from Firas of some of the exciting potential developments in wearables. And a reminder, I see quite a large amount of people now are definitely in the auditorium. So yeah, you can definitely hear me. So if you have any questions for Firas, please pop them in the Q&A at any time. Okay, so we are now going to turn to the flip side of all this and look at what all these developments could mean for our privacy and indeed safety. Do we need stricter rules to safeguard us from future tech advancements? Nira van Zalk, pictured on your slide, is a lecturer in the Dyson School for Design Engineering. She looks at the psychological mechanisms that govern our behavior, emotions, and decision-making. So having her expertise on the project has definitely been incredibly important. Nira, I can't wait for your presentation, so over to you.
Thank you, Kieran, and thanks, Firas, for that really interesting intro. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. I often get to cover the sort of more negative aspects, and I should also like to say that the stuff I'll be talking about is primarily concerning what's known as the wellness devices. So as Firas has made it very clear, the medical and wellness devices are subject to differing levels of regulation. And the wellness devices are currently subject to less stringent guidelines. Now, most of us have access to one of these. I'm wearing an Apple iWatch, for example. And as Firas also mentioned, there is a fuzzy demarcation between what constitutes medical and wellness device. And this will continue to be the case because we're seeing an improved analytical ability of wellness devices by the use of non-invasive biosensors to continuously kind of improve, become incorporated into available off-the-shelf devices. And sensors are also becoming increasingly capable of collecting all manner of data. So most of us will very soon have something, or we already have something akin to a small chemical lab and a computer on our wrist, on our fingers, around our necks, for example. There's going to be a variety of these kind of wearables that will become prominent in our lives. And of course, much merit is given to this development, deservedly, because as Firas has mentioned, there's lots of really cool medical applications for that's going to open up useful areas to improve people's physical and mental health globally. I should also say next slide, by the way, because all of this is on my next slide, Kieran. Yeah, thank you. And it opens up all manner of avenue towards personalized healthcare for humans, and as Firas mentioned, for pets. We might see increasing availability of this kind of data for our GPs or our vets in the future. Issues could be flagged long before they emerge. So these are all really wonderful scenarios from a future kind of a medicine point of view. But like Kieran has hinted, there is in fact a little bit of a flip side. And I will say next slide, please, Kieran. The first concern is privacy. This is a well-used term that most of us kind of ascribe to care about, but in fact, the majority of us ignore when we are engaging with technologies of any kind. This is indicative of something called the privacy paradox. People say they care, but then their behaviors would indicate that they really don't, because they just give away all manner of data. And the commercial devices that we wear, interestingly enough, are not necessarily isolated. Most of the time, actually, they're becoming increasingly interconnected with other sensors. And these in turn send this data back to parent companies and also third parties. So these so-called Internet of Things technologies are becoming ever persuasive, and smart devices are increasingly prevalent in our private as well as our public spaces. And there are indeed sneaky ways that companies can deduce information about us, even from the simplest of the wellness devices available. So information like heart rate or skin temperature and accelerometer data, these can all be used to understand stress responses, can be combined with other information to deduce our reactions, and that can help tailor ads, for example. And if this sounds a little bit like a dystopia, it's already happening. There's another concern, which is accuracy of wellness devices in particular. Obviously, medical devices have much higher claims on this, but I would say the wellness devices are increasingly moving into this area, and they're making claims about accuracy, which isn't necessarily supported with what they're able to do. So accuracy is still an issue, and I think that's something that needs to be highlighted to consumers when it comes to wellness devices in particular. Next slide, please. So many of us are uncomfortable with the idea that we could have our lives quantified and shared with third-party or commercial actors, because much of this data that can be collected through wearables is actually quite personal and intimate. And this brings me to the idea of the quantified self. This thought that not many of us would actually want to be quantifying our behaviors and everything we do 24/7. Most of us would cringe at the idea of a company collecting data on, for example, our bodily functions like toilet habits or sexual activities, right? And this sounds really rather dystopian, but it's perfectly possible to do this with current technologies. And it's most often aided by ourselves because we are rather ignorant as consumers. And as users, we often have very little insight where all this data is going. Much of this is hidden in the 40+ pages of terms and conditions that we often ignore when we get a new device and we engage with it, right? Because who wants to read 40 pages of T's and C's? It's very boring. And in the wellness device industry, particularly, there are growing concerns about what happens to your data once it leaves the wearable device, how it's used, how it's protected, whether it's potentially being misused, such as, for example, being sold onward to third parties. This is already happening. So, for example, if we use Google, information about our online clicks and searches are being sold to advertisers who can then try and sell us products more effectively because they know what we're looking for. And there's nothing currently to stop this to happen for wearables. And there's no clear regulation that would stop misuse of individual data from wearable devices, I would say. And we could argue that having access to such a wealth of intimate health data where companies can effectively deduce a lot about our physical and mental health can open us up to all manner of vulnerabilities. There are differences between companies in terms of their privacy policies. If we, let's say, compare Fitbit and Apple, right? Apple pride themselves on being very privacy focused, but nevertheless, there's currently no legislation that can stop commercial companies from collecting data from each user that could be misused in a commercial sense. So protecting user information really is paramount. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to end my bit by summarizing quickly what we recommend in this white paper. This is not just my own recommendation. This is everyone who contributed here. Obviously, it's really important that we have clear legislation that requires companies to inform users about how their data will be used and seek their permission to the use of data. Now, I would actually like to say that I added this bit myself because I think we need to circumvent the dreaded T&Cs. We currently have a system where it's not really easy for people to understand what is going to be happening to their data. So we have to have up-to-date regulation that makes it very clear for users who are non-specialist audiences as well as specialist audiences what will be happening to their data. And to achieve this, really, we need multidisciplinary collaboration across regulators and companies and academics and medical health professionals and everyone, because obviously we want these devices to be really helpful to people rather than create problems. And I should just add very cheekily that, of course, at Imperial College, we have all the various range of expertise needed to develop these technologies. And we are actually quite uniquely placed to inform policy and regulation. So that's what I had. Thank you.
Fantastic, Neera. Thank you very much. So yes, some very important issues that that Neera has raised there, which we will come on to right now, in fact, as we move on to our panel discussion. So we welcome back Neera and Firas, and welcome two new panelists. So we have Madeline Griffiths, who is a Senior Policy Officer in the Information Commissioner's Office, and they are the UK's independent authority set up to uphold information rights in the public interest and also to promote openness by public bodies and data privacy for individuals. We're also joined by David Granger. He's the technical lead in software, artificial intelligence and MRI at the MHRA, the agency responsible for regulating medical devices. So welcome to everyone. It's really great to see you all in one place. And just a quick reminder to our virtual audience watching in to pop any questions you have in the Q&A. And we will try to get to your question before the end. Okay, so first off, Madeline, I want to get your initial reaction from the points that Neera has raised there in her conclusions. So yeah, if we could also hear both, well, your initial reaction, but also some of the current work that the ICO is doing related to this.
Certainly, no, thank you. And it's been lovely to see the presentations about the work that Imperial is doing. It's fascinating to see the potential of wearables on a range of different levels. My initial reaction to the paper is, yes, anybody who says I want clearer regulation of a sector, I want to stand up and cheer. That is music to my ears, because we do. Something that is sort of very dear to my heart is that the clearer the regulation is and the clearer the legislation is, the easier it is for members of the public who don't have access to lawyers or aren't lawyers to defend their own rights. And I think so long as there is any confusion over what can and can't be done, it's a lot harder for the individual to defend their rights. As far as current ICO work is concerned, we are very interested in wearables. Some of the things we've been looking at are where that wearable is using special category data, what in the old days we used to call sensitive data, where that data is going, and things about, is the individual in control of where their data goes and how a particular app uses their data? What's the consent management platform like? Do they really have an empowered choice or not? So that's some of the areas we're looking at the minute.
Great, and I'm sure we'll come back to that empowered choice, which I think ties in quite nicely to what Neera was saying about T's and C's. I think Neera's words were it's boring to read, so no one reads them, which is probably not the worst assumption I've ever heard. But before we go on to that, I really want to hear from David. I guess, David, and Firak talked about this in his presentation, that the blurring of the medical and the wellness device industries makes your job, I guess, a lot more complicated, right? So trying to decide what is or isn't a medical device, you know, is it up to sufficient levels of accuracy for whatever it does? So yeah, again, like I asked Madeline, you know, what's your reaction to what we're saying, and yeah, what current activities are you doing in the MHRA on this?
Yeah, so it's a really good review. The novel products we're seeing inquiries about for wearable tech, particularly as manufacturers often push the borderland with medical devices. And there's also issues where a device product is used medically, but it's not actually intended by the manufacturer to be used for that medical purpose. That again is a big part of, well, we can regulate the manufacturer, but we can't regulate the use. Just to note, we don't regulate anything to do with animals. That's an important point. So we're only regulating devices for humans. as to what we're doing at the moment, so a lot of my time, the team's time, is answering those queries that manufacturers asked. Is this a device? And then we have to look at their intended purpose. We will look at the disclaimers we see, and in the past, the regulations require us to look at what a manufacturer says on instructions for use, etc. But we're increasingly now turning to look at what a consumer might think the intended purpose is of a product. Look at when they look at the advertising they've seen, social media about this product. Well, it's saying in the Twitter, it's a medical device, but although it might be in the instructions, this is not for medical use, then we're going to have to say it's actually a device because people think it's a device and they're using it as devices. And we're changing how we're going to regulate these products. We're looking at compliance cases. Again, we've recently got some new compliance and enforcement powers that we're looking forward to using. We're looking at adverse incidents that people report to us with failures that might result in harm to patients. And again, the past year, we've been looking at applications for use of wearable devices in acceptable use authorization. So these are for non-medical devices over the COVID period that we will give an authorization to be used while COVID's with us. And the big amount of work that we're going to get through to is draft regulations for our new regulatory scheme coming in 2023. So that is a lot of the work I'm doing at the moment.
Sounds like you're a busy man. Yeah, because I guess kind of taking up one of those points, like a lot, and through writing this paper, it really seems that you know, a lot of the wellness device and the apps associated with wellness devices, it's kind of something of a Wild West at the minute. You know, we talked about T's and C's. You know, I think it's the case in many jurisdictions that if you just say somewhere in your, you know, in your app's T's and C, this is not a medical device, that kind of gets you out of jail free from kind of a raft of I guess MHRA legislation. So yeah, is that something, David, that you're going to kind of factor in? Probably something like what you said, being more consumer oriented.
It is definitely something we do not take into account disclaimers if elsewhere manufacturers are saying that it can be used for a medical purpose. And the number of times we see, oh, it's not for diagnosis, it's not a diagnostic tool, but it's being used for that. And it's clear that it is intended to be used for a diagnostic purpose. Then we will regulate it as such, and we'll get the device taken off the market if we need to.
Yeah. So just a great question from Tony. Tony asks, how far could health or wellness data be covered by GDPR or a strengthened version of it? So I guess, Maddie, that's one for you.
Yes, a strengthened GDPR. I'm trying to sort of get to what the request is trying to ask about, really, because personal data, whether it's health data, whether it's biometric data, is coming under GDPR as it stands. We are looking at sort of how we put out different bits of guidance and so on. But more than that, I think it's the work that sort of the ICO as regulator of the legislation is doing in the background with some of the organisations about this, to say, you know, what does privacy look like? What should consent look like? So, I mean, I'm not quite sure what they mean by strengthen GDPR, because one of the difficulties with GDPR as it stands, if I can controversially say it, is that it tries to identify each thing it may apply to, whereas traditional English law, it was designed to be interpretable so that the rights could be defended in that way.
Yeah, I guess
as written.
I guess maybe if you were to maybe take the question forward, it's maybe what Neera talked about, that kind of what Armageddon like you know, scenario of companies just, you know, having all this data about every facet of your life. Is any of that kind of covered within GDPR, or is there kind of some way that companies are circumventing that? It's
not that companies are circumventing GDPR, it's that they're ignoring it exists. Because there are plenty of protections for the individual in the GDPR. There are plenty of prohibitions. I mean, for example, special category data shouldn't be processed at all under the GDPR unless you've got a basis for it. It shouldn't be happening. Data should not be being passed on to another organisation without transparency about that. But our first principle of the GDPR is that the processing is lawful, fair and transparent. And to give you an idea why I have such strong views about transparency, I will use a very low-tech example. I could transparently tell you that I'm going to burgle your house tomorrow. I could tell you what time I'm going to do it. It doesn't mean it's okay for me to do it. So the terms and conditions of a wearable device going on for 14 pages or more, saying exactly what we're going to do, still doesn't mean it's okay. And it doesn't mean you've got informed consent if it's been put across in such a way that the end user cannot understand what is really meant by, what they're really consenting to. It wouldn't count as valid consent.
Yeah, I've got a philosophical question, I guess, from an anonymous questioner, and they ask, at what point does a wearable become an extension of oneself? Maybe Firat, do you want to look into the crystal ball and answer that one?
I guess we already have computers that we more or less carry around all the time with us, our smartphones. They have become an extension of ourselves, and in a way they are a wearable accessory as well, except we don't put them on our wrists and so on, and they stay in our pockets, and they do collect all kinds of interesting data and give access to really information. I think they are already an extension of ourselves. I mean, in a way, we wake up in the morning, probably most of us, if it's not one of the first things that we do in the morning, we check our phone, it's probably right at the top of the list. What's going on today? Check the weather, or check the emails or the news, or things like this. So it has already become an extension of us. It's just that, will this extension be more consolidated in the future, and then these devices will just come closer and closer and closer and then go inside us? I think this is the question that we should probably be asking. And it seems like from the looks of it, that's what's going to happen. Not only an extension, it'll become probably really part of us, like an organ.
And is that something you could see in a decade's time? You were talking about microneedles, for example. Could a wellness device, or let's say the equivalent of what we think now, like an Apple Watch or a Fitbit, could that come with a microneedle?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I mean, there are companies that are developing these technologies into commercial products, and they're doing it now. And a little bit different than academia, where the time scales are a little bit different. Companies, they need to get to the product relatively quickly. So that means that there is already that the race has started, and we might see these devices maybe not even 10 years, 5 years time, even if probably even sooner than that.
Yeah. Neera, I've got to bring you in at this point, because I want to hear more. Well, I don't know if I want to hear more, but I feel like we should hear more about how wearables could be used, and I'm particularly interested by the kind of human behavior aspect of, could a wearable be used to maybe modify or nudge, to use that expression, someone's behavior? And are you seeing that in your research already?
Yeah, and actually that ties into what Firat was just saying, because it's an interesting question, this whole idea about extending yourself. If I'm dependent on a device to change my behavior. So let's say I want to work out more often and I want to stand up more often throughout the day, and I have my Apple Watch remind me to do that. But if I'm not wearing the watch, and and if I don't follow through that behavior change, has the device really changed my behavior? These are the claims, right, that some of these companies are making. I would argue that it hasn't, unless I'm actually gotten into the habit of standing up and working out without the need of the device. But then, of course, why do we need the device, right? So it's a really interesting question there. Also about human autonomy, I think, is one of these research areas where I'm doing some work, whereby what constitutes autonomous behavior and what claims could these companies make when it comes to at least the wellness side of things, where they're saying that they're going to help relieve our anxiety, or they're going, because all of that work needs to be done by ourselves, and once we're done, basically, shall we throw away the wearable, right? They really don't want us to do that. The downside of some of this is, and I think going back to what you asked, Kieran, is what happens when a company actually, and this is increasingly happening now, understands what people are feeling, not in a very sophisticated way, mainly based on a kind of stress response. But what happens when that becomes even more sophisticated? Amazon have filed a couple of years back for patent, where they are taking audio data from their smart device in our homes, from the device that everyone has in their home, basically, and they're able to take from that data, deduce people's gender and their current emotional state and things like that. This is actually a thing that they're doing right now, and these patents are being continually kind of expanded. So the question is, are we really free to make our own choices and make our own decisions if we are being continuously de facto nudged by companies into making more appropriate decisions based on what we're feeling and what we've expressed that we've searched for and where our interest lies? I would actually argue that we're moving more towards a kind of a Wall-E scenario where we're losing kind of, human autonomy. That sounds really quite horrible, and I don't want that to be the case. But I think with the increasing availability and usage of these devices, we haven't really had this discussion amongst ourselves as a society. What is okay for these devices to do and what's not okay for them to do? And how far can they nudge us, and how much can they change us? And when does our dependence on them kind of stop?
Yeah, I've said it before and I'll say it again. Your research sounds like something out of the Black Mirror TV series, Nira. That's some absolutely powerful and very scary stuff there. And so I'm just going to go back to our questions from our audience. So we've got a great question in from Ken, and Ken is in the IMSE Emirates. And so they basically want to know, if you want to get into wearable tech in terms of research, where should you start, and what should you be researching, I guess, or what courses should you be looking at? So I guess that's one for Firat again, and maybe Nira as well, if you've any thoughts, or anyone for that matter.
I think the space is really big. No matter what your background is, there will probably be something for you to do. I mean, if you come from a design background, obviously there's a lot of design work, because at the end of the day, these are accessories that we wear, and there's the human element that requires a lot of attention. Chemistry, that's really the future. I mean, that's how we see it, that we know that it's going to be more, because with non-invasive data or non-invasive methods, the access to the biochemistry of the body is very limited. Sweat probably being an exception, but we really need to have data or chemical data concerning our biochemistry, and there's just so much to do for an individual with a background in chemistry, and of course materials. Manufacturing, these are all important. and as well as the person mentioned, electronics and software. It really is a entire landscape of wearable devices. It's a very multidisciplinary field. So no matter kind of what you come from, and even including policy, I mean, that's what we're discussing right now. So no matter kind of what background you come from, there will probably be something for you to do. And but just to specifically talk about, for example, electronics, you don't really need a lot of knowledge to hack a device, a simple electronic device, together at home. I mean, Arduino kits and so on are readily available. There are a ton of tutorials on YouTube, and it really is not very hard to learn the very basics of electronics and then start building from there. But I think what becomes very powerful is when you combine, let's say, chemistry, knowledge of your knowledge of chemistry with your knowledge in electronics and other fields. Then I think it would be very, very attractive, also in terms of employment perspectives in the future for any student in chemistry. So if you just want to stay in chemistry, you can. But I also highly recommend that you learn a little bit of electronics too, if you want to, or software if you want to.
Yeah, thank you, Firat. That's really, really useful, and I hope Kane found it useful too. So just in the interest of time, I'm just going to move on to an absolutely cracking question from an anonymous questioner. And I think this is probably one for David, I think. So it's quite a long one. So how far do the panel believe that burying purposes and uses within 40 pages of T's and C's that come within the box of a new device actually constitutes consent or satisfies transparency obligations? And this is from an NHS information governance background. I would be concerned about compliance on either front. Over to you, David, I guess.
Okay, so in the past, we would have said, well, manufacturers said this, so that's the intended purpose and you have to follow it. But as we're seeing, we're changing how we look at what are in the terms and conditions, the instructions for use, and we're also looking at what a consumer thinks that product is for, not what's hidden in the T's and C's. So for us, it's what we as a regulator, or we've been looking at asking consumers what they think about products are for, what they think about it. So we're changing how we regulate as far as medical device is concerned for, is it a device or is it not a device?
Okay, and it's followed by an even better question, I think, because this question is really the purpose of why we're here today. And the question is the Apple iWatch classified as a medical device? The advertisement seems to allude to that. It mentions healthcare and not medical device or wellness device. So maybe that might be an interesting one to kind of go around to the four of you and just kind of hear your different perspectives on what you think. So I'm going to start with David again, if that's right, David.
Looking at the instructions for use, which I've done this before, the watch is not a medical device. It's not CE marked as a medical device, but the software with the medical functionality for ECG and AF detection are both CE marked medical devices. So the combination, so medical device regulations apply to things in combination to get a thing to work. So the combination is effectively a medical device of the software, which is CE marked, and the hardware, because one won't run without the other.
Okay, great. Maddie, do you want to?
I agree with David, absolutely, because it's the device itself has a range of functions that wouldn't be medical, so you couldn't quantify it that way, but some of the apps specifically will be.
Yeah. Neera, have you got an opinion?
Well, actually, it's quite interesting because I had a student do her master's project, now just finished it, where she compared data from a clinically graded device called Empatica E4, which collects things like heart rate and skin temperature and whatnot. And she compared it to Apple iWatch data. She asked people to actually, there were people who were willing to do stuff. We ran an experiment and then they downloaded their own data and sent it to us. And if we just look at it from the point of view of data, it is highly granular and very rich and very difficult to distinguish from the Empatica data itself, at least when it comes to heart rate. So this is an interesting question for our policymakers in the room. You know, what actually constitutes it? Are we talking about the devices, or are we talking about the data that comes out of the devices? Because the data is certainly, as far as a researcher goes, right, it is basically, to me, very, very close to a clinical device. So
yeah, and Firat, I guess we're going to have we're going to have a lot more conversations like this if you know, looking at your presentation, that world that's already blurring is just going to continue, isn't it?
Yeah, I think again, the examples are there, so the precedent has been set, I would say. So and it really feels very much like a one-way road from now. So we will see more and more of this. And for example, if we look at the Western world, where, you know, the regulatory agencies are very strong and strict, these technologies, for example, may happen more slowly or may not happen. But there are many countries in the world where also, I mean, regulation is absolutely not a problem at all, and people are getting richer, disposable incomes are getting bigger, and of course they will be able to afford this. So and that's again another aspect of this entire industry developing, because it's a global industry, and even if we, you know, like, try to control it as much as we can, and I feel like, you know, it will still probably develop at the speed that it's developing right now. Maybe that's a pessimistic view, maybe optimistic, I don't know, but that's kind of my view.
Yeah. So I'm just going to take a few more questions. Yeah, another great question from anonymous questioner. So they ask, what can a subdermal microdevice measure in terms of mental health? So I guess that Nir or Firat, could you take that one?
Happy to. I can take it. I would imagine that you know, again, this field is relatively new. So, but in terms of mental health, like just starting with the physical measurements, for example, you know, breathing, and then the heart patterns, and even I don't know, posture and so on, and these things could be in a way calibrated to a person's baseline metrics, and you can see how this person's emotions are changing over time. But if we're talking about subdermal, that means that we also have access to the chemistry within the body, where we can tap into hormones and then other analyze that would be indicative of our mood at the current state. So it can really do a lot. But of course, the field is relatively new, and we don't have so much going on in that area yet. But it doesn't mean that that's not going to happen in the future, and perhaps as some views as well.
Okay, Nira, did you want to come in and say anything there, or?
Yes, I mean, like Firat says, I'm not really aware of any technologies right now that are using this to sort of chart mental health, but I can definitely see all of the things that Firat mentioned could be usable. Actually, lots of different kinds of data can be used as proxies to indicate mental health. Even, you know, if you're spending all day long looking at a certain website, I could argue that, you know, that might be indicative of having a problem, right? Whereas like you're not living your life. So the data can be used in very different ways to approximate where people are at in terms of both physical as well as mental health. And we are moving much stronger in that direction in terms of what products are being developed. And you know, again, I'm not against this. I think, you know, there are some wonderful medical applications for this, but I do struggle somewhat with the idea of this being collected commercially and sold onwards, for example.
Yeah, and I think we might have slightly scared some of the people watching in, because we have a question, and yeah, this person wants to know if they should do anything now. So maybe they own a wearable device, and is there anything they should do as individuals to protect their own personal data? Maybe for devices in general, I suppose this is a good question for. They give examples such as cookies and websites. GDPR gives the option of opting out. However, for many devices, this isn't much of an option. So I guess Maddie, probably you might be in the best place to pick this up.
Yeah, I think time spent with your privacy settings is time well spent. To look through what's really happening with your data within device. But what I would also say, so to developers out there who are feeling a bit jumpy, if you read no other part of the GDPR, please read Article 25 and embrace it about what data protection by default and design really means. Because the deployment of your technology, if you want to see it lift, if you want to see it take off, good data protection compliance is going to be part of the way of doing that. But for the individual, yes, time well spent with your privacy settings. And I have to say, it's a regular conversation at our office with some of the large stakeholders in this area about, you know, reasonable consent management platforms and so on. Yeah,
and just aware of time, so 2 minutes left. And I think I kind of want to ask quite a broad question, really. So we have an anonymous questioner that asks about the age-appropriate design code. So I know Neera actually worked with the Information Commissioner's office to develop this. So I guess part one of my question is asking Neera, you know, what was that like talking to a regulator like the ICO? And then my second question is both to Maddie and David, and I'm very much aware that there are a lot of academics watching this and maybe policymakers as well watching this, who are trying to kind of figure out how to work best with each other. You know, one of our main conclusions is that we should. So yeah, how should we? So yeah, Neera, if I can.
Yeah, I should just clarify that really I did not develop the age-appropriate design code. That is definitely ICO's baby. I have had a wonderful collaboration with the head of technology, Ali Shah, and Joe Petter, who's also, I believe she might be a senior legal manager or something like that. But some wonderful individuals at the ICO where we've kind of road tested this code. I've had my students who are design engineering students develop product innovations and technological innovations, kind of mock-ups, ideas about how could we develop these technologies, but using the code to show that it's possible. And that is to go back to your question, Kieran, how can we do this more? But we just have to engage with each other. I mean, I spoke to Ali after a BBC conference and she said, oh, we're developing this code. We're going to be launching it. Are you interested in doing a collaboration? And it had never really struck me as an academic that I could do an entire module where my students are developing technology based on these legislation, what will be sort of legislation, and having them not necessarily constrained by them, but inspired by them, right? It's a very different way to think about it. And I think that's been a fantastic exercise, which I'm hoping to continue with. And I think as academics and as legislators and policymakers and, you know, researchers in different spheres, we have to remain open to these kinds of collabs.
Thanks, Neera. And yeah, just I guess the final words go to you, David and Maddie. Just, you know, what can we give from academia that would be of help to you guys?
So it's an exciting time for us in medical devices, and there's a consultation on new regulations which is going to be published mid-July, and that's going to influence how we regulate devices from 2023 in Great Britain. So watch out for that consultation and give us your thoughts, please.
And from the ICO perspective, I think it is a really exciting time, as David said, and what we particularly want to know is what's working for you and what isn't, because the nature of innovation is it hops from one sector to the next. Innovations pop up in one sector and they work fine, put them in another context, and suddenly they engage with a whole different set of regulation. So speak to us as a regulator to say where things aren't working for you, so that we can look at where regulators need to communicate better with one another about the sticking points where two regulations intersect.
Okay, duly noted, both of those. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Our time is up. We've actually gone slightly over, so apologies to everyone. So yeah, thank you so much to the four of you. That was an incredibly interesting discussion. I'm sure we could have gone on for easily another hour anyway, but mercifully, probably for you, we'll stop. So just before we go, final reminder to those of you watching in that you can find a link to the briefing paper in the chat. You can also find out more content on wearable tech if we've whetted your appetite, including some podcasts featuring Nira and others, all on the IMSE website. So that's www.imperial.ac.uk/IMSE. And hopefully, yeah, it's appearing there on the slide. You can also find previous briefing papers that we've done on everything from antimicrobial surfaces to greener plastics on our website too. So final thanks to Nira, Firas, David and Maddie, and indeed all the co-authors that took part in the briefing paper. It was such a great project to work on. So many thanks to everyone. And to all of you at home, wherever you are. So yeah, hopefully we haven't completely scared you off the concept of wearable technology, or maybe you can't wait to get one. I can't wait to get my smart tattoos. So there you go. So all of us, from all of us here in very overcast, rainy London, take care and bye for now.